In the crimson glow of a dying western sunset, a young cattle rancher made his way toward the abandoned riverbank. He never expected that on the far shore, a breathtakingly beautiful Apache girl would be washing away the dust of the trail. When the thin fabric slipped from her shoulders, moonlight kissed her warm bronze skin, leaving him frozen in place. His heart hammered against his ribs, eyes unable to look away. But when she turned, her gaze cut through him like a blade, not with shame, but with the fierce pride of an unconquered native daughter. She stepped toward him, river water spraying with each determined stride. In that instant, the rancher understood. From this moment forward, his fate would veer onto a path filled with danger, passion, and brutal trials between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. The territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the blazing Arizona sun, where red mesas jutted from the earth like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. This was 1873, when the frontier still bled from fresh wounds of expansion and resistance. Jacob Matthews had carved his modest ranch from this hostile landscape with nothing but determination and calloused hands. At 26, he possessed the weathered face of a man twice his age, earned through countless dawns spent mending fences and nights fighting off rustlers and predators. His spread consisted of 200 head of cattle, a ramshackle cabin, and dreams that felt as distant as the snow-capped peaks on the horizon. Jacob had come west after the war, carrying only his father's rifle and a stubborn refusal to surrender to poverty. The land demanded everything: blood, sweat, and frequently tears, but it also promised something the crowded eastern cities never could: freedom to forge your own destiny. Yet freedom came with a price that went beyond physical hardship. The Apache had roamed these valleys for generations before any white settler ever laid claim to the soil. Their ancestral hunting grounds now bore fence posts and grazing cattle, creating tensions that simmered like heat rising from sun-baked rocks. Most ranchers viewed the Apache as obstacles to progress, dangerous shadows to be eliminated or driven onto distant reservations. Jacob had always tried to maintain neutrality, focusing on his cattle and avoiding the escalating conflicts that claimed neighbors on both sides. The morning had been particularly brutal, with 3 calves lost to what looked like mountain lion attacks, though Jacob suspected rustlers might have been involved. His closest neighbor, Tom Bradley, had ridden over at sunset with a bottle of whiskey and dire warnings about increased Apache activity in the region. According to Tom, several homesteads to the north had reported missing livestock and strange fires spotted in the hills after dark. Jacob listened with half his attention while examining the damaged fence line that would require repairs before morning. He understood the fear that drove men like Tom to see enemies in every shadow, but something in him resisted the hatred that seemed to consume other settlers. Perhaps it was his memories of the war, where he had learned that human nature remained complex regardless of the color of a man's skin or the language he spoke. As evening approached, Jacob decided to check the water rights along Willow Creek, where his cattle gathered to drink during the hottest part of each day. The creek wound through a narrow canyon lined with cottonwoods, creating a natural oasis that had drawn both wildlife and wanderers for countless centuries. Jacob often found solace in this secluded spot, especially when the pressures of frontier life became overwhelming. The path down to the creek bed was treacherous and fading light, requiring careful navigation around loose rocks and hidden gopher holes that could snap a horse's leg. Jacob dismounted and led his mare on foot, listening to the gentle murmur of running water growing stronger with each step. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another from the opposite ridge. He had almost reached the water when he heard something that didn't belong in the wilderness: symphony, the sound of human movement, subtle but unmistakable to ears trained by years of frontier survival. Jacob froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Raiders sometimes used water sources as ambush points, and he had no intention of walking blindly into a trap that could cost him his life. Crouching behind a fallen log, Jacob peered through the twilight toward the sound's source. What he saw defied every expectation and sent his pulse racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or danger. On the opposite bank of Willow Creek, perhaps 30 yards away, stood the most beautiful woman Jacob had ever encountered. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, her long black hair catching the last rays of sunset like polished obsidian. Her skin held the warm bronze tone of desert peoples, and she wore traditional Apache clothing that spoke of a heritage stretching back through generations of proud warriors and wise women. She had been washing herself in the creek's shallow pools, and as Jacob watched in stunned silence, she began to remove the buckskin dress that clung to her lithe form. The garment fell away like water, revealing curves that seemed sculpted by the same forces that had shaped the surrounding landscape, beautiful, natural, and utterly captivating. Jacob knew he should look away, retreat silently, and pretend this encounter had never occurred. Everything about his upbringing and the frontier code of honor demanded that he respect her privacy and withdraw immediately. But something held him frozen in place, mesmerized by a vision that seemed to belong more to dreams than waking reality. The Apache woman stepped deeper into the creek, allowing the cool water to flow around her legs while she cupped handfuls to splash across her shoulders and arms. She hummed softly, a melody that carried hints of ancient traditions and stories passed down through countless generations. The sound blended perfectly with the creek's gentle babbling and the evening breeze rustling through cottonwood leaves. Jacob realized he was holding his breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might shatter this magical moment and bring consequences he wasn't prepared to face. His rational mind screamed warnings about the danger of this situation, but his heart had seized control of his actions, demanding that he remain and witness this scene of pure, unspoiled beauty. Then she turned, and their eyes met across the narrow expanse of water. The Apache woman didn't scream or dive for cover as Jacob expected. Instead, she straightened to her full height and fixed him with a gaze that burned with intelligence, defiance, and something else, perhaps curiosity about this white man who had stumbled into her private sanctuary. Her dark eyes seemed to see straight through his soul, cataloging his intentions and measuring his character in a single, endless moment. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the magnitude of his transgression. He had violated not only her privacy but also the complex web of cultural boundaries that kept the fragile peace between settlers and Apache tribes. This woman was no ordinary frontier dweller. The quality of her clothing and the proud bearing she maintained, even in this compromising situation, suggested she held significant status within her community. She took a step toward the bank, water dripping from her skin like liquid starlight. Her expression remained unreadable, but Jacob detected no fear in her demeanor. If anything, she seemed to be evaluating him with the same calculated assessment a hunter might give to unexpected prey that had wandered into range of her bow. Jacob tried to speak, to offer apologies or explanations, but his voice had abandoned him completely. He could only kneel there behind the fallen log, caught between the desire to flee and an inexplicable compulsion to remain and face whatever judgment this remarkable woman might render upon his intrusion. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken words and dangerous possibilities. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Jacob understood that this moment would divide his life into distinct chapters before and after he had looked into the eyes of an Apache woman bathing in Willow Creek under a dying desert Sunday. She reached for her dress, her movements deliberate and unhurried, never breaking eye contact with the white man who had dared to witness her vulnerability. As she pulled the buckskin garment over her head, Jacob caught a glimpse of a small silver pendant that hung from a leather cord around her neck, a symbol he didn't recognize, but which clearly held deep personal significance. When she was once again clothed, the Apache woman stepped onto the bank and began walking directly toward Jacob's hiding place. Her bare feet made no sound on the rocky ground, and she moved with the predatory grace of a mountain cat stalking through familiar territory. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation that could end in violence, negotiation, or something entirely unexpected. Jacob's hand tightened on his revolver, though he had no intention of drawing the weapon unless absolutely necessary for self-defense. The woman approaching him was unarmed except for a small knife tucked into her belt, but he knew better than to underestimate the fighting abilities of Apache warriors, regardless of gender. Stories circulated throughout the territory of Apache women who fought alongside their male counterparts with deadly efficiency when circumstances demanded it. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, her dark eyes boring into his with an intensity that made Jacob feel completely exposed and vulnerable, despite being fully clothed and armed. When she finally spoke, her English was clear and precise, colored by only the slightest accent that suggested Apache was her native tongue. "You watch like a hungry wolf," she said, her voice carrying neither embarrassment nor anger, but rather a statement of fact that demanded acknowledgement. "Why do you hide in shadows instead of declaring yourself like a man with honor?" Jacob struggled to find words adequate to this unprecedented situation. Everything he had learned about Apache customs suggested that his presence here constituted a grave insult that could provoke retaliation against not only himself but potentially against other settlers in the region. Yet this woman seemed more interested in understanding his motivations than in punishing his transgression. "I didn't mean to intrude," Jacob finally managed, his voice rough with embarrassment and something deeper that he couldn't quite identify. "I came to check the water for my cattle and heard sounds. I should have announced myself or left immediately." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intense focus she might give to tracking signs in soft earth. "You speak truth, but not complete truth. Fear did not hold you in place, white rancher. What name do your people call you?" The directness of her question caught Jacob off guard. In his limited interactions with Apache individuals, conversations had typically been brief and formal, focused on practical matters like water rights or boundary disputes. This woman seemed genuinely interested in him as a person rather than simply as a representative of the expanding white settlement. "Jacob Matthews," he replied, slowly rising from his crouch but keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I run cattle about 2 miles east of here, near the old Spanish Trail." She nodded as if filing this information away for future reference. "I am called Aiyana," she said, using what Jacob assumed was her Apache name. "My people know of the man who builds fences but does not shoot at shadows in the night." This surprised Jacob considerably. He had assumed his attempts at neutrality had gone unnoticed by the local Apache bands, but apparently his restraint in avoiding the conflicts that consumed many of his neighbors had been observed and noted. The realization that he had been watched and evaluated without his knowledge was both unsettling and oddly flattering. "Your reputation travels far," Jacob Matthews, Aiyana continued, moving to stand beside a large boulder that jutted from the creek bank. "Some of my people say you are a man who might be trusted when the time comes for difficult choices." Jacob felt the weight of implication in her words, though he couldn't fully grasp what she might be suggesting. The political situation between settlers and Apache bands was growing more volatile with each passing month, and he suspected that neutrality might soon become impossible to maintain regardless of his personal preferences. "What kind of choices?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer might complicate his life in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her gaze shifting from Jacob to the creek and then to the darkening sky overhead. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened slightly, revealing hints of the woman beneath the warrior's composure. "Choices that will determine whether our peoples continue to spill each other's blood until the desert drinks it all," she said, "or whether we find another path that honors both the old ways and the new reality that cannot be changed." The conversation had taken a turn that Jacob never could have anticipated when he first spotted her in the creek. What had begun as an embarrassing breach of privacy had evolved into something that felt remarkably like a diplomatic overture from someone who clearly held influence within her community. "I never wanted conflict with your people," Jacob said carefully, weighing each word for potential misunderstanding. "I just want to raise my cattle and build something lasting on this land." "And if that building requires my people to disappear?" Aiyana asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Jacob considered the question seriously before responding. "The land is big enough for different ways of living," he said, "but I'm just one man with one opinion. I can't speak for others who might see things differently." Aiyana nodded approvingly, as if his answer had confirmed something she had hoped to hear. "Honest words have more value than pretty lies," she said. "Perhaps there will be time to explore such thoughts further." Jacob Matthews, who builds fences but respects boundaries. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "You should not return to this place alone," she said. "Some of my people are less interested in conversation than I am, and your presence here could be misunderstood in dangerous ways." With that warning, She disappeared into the gathering darkness as silently as a desert spirit, leaving Jacob alone beside the creek with his racing thoughts and the lingering scent of sage and wildflowers that seemed to cling to the spot where she had stood. The ride back to his cabin passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and practical concerns that Jacob couldn't seem to organize into any coherent pattern. His encounter with Aiyana had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but it felt as though his entire understanding of the world had been shifted onto unfamiliar ground that might prove either fertile or treacherous depending on choices he hadn't known he would need to make. Sleep proved elusive when he finally reached the sanctuary of his small cabin. Jacob found himself staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams while replaying every word and gesture from their meeting beside Willow Creek. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons why any further contact with an Apache woman would be not only inappropriate but potentially suicidal for a man in his position. Yet something deeper than rational thought had been awakened by Aiyana's direct gaze and enigmatic words about choices that might determine the future relationship between their peoples. Jacob had come west seeking freedom and independence, but he was beginning to understand that true freedom sometimes required taking stands that carried personal risks most men would consider unacceptable. His neighbor Tom Bradley arrived the next morning with fresh coffee and disturbing news from the territorial capital. According to reports carried by the weekly mail rider, tensions between settlers and Apache bands had erupted into open warfare in several districts to the south and east. Cattle raids had increased dramatically, and at least 3 homesteads had been burned in apparent retaliation for military actions taken against Apache winter camps. "They're saying the Army's going to establish a permanent garrison near Silver Creek," Tom reported while Jacob poured coffee into chipped ceramic mugs. "About time, if you ask me. These peaceful overtures and treaty negotiations haven't accomplished anything except giving the Apaches time to organize more raids." Jacob listened without comment, remembering Aiyana's words about difficult choices that might determine whether the cycle of violence would continue or find some alternative resolution. He wondered if she had anticipated these latest developments, or if her people were already preparing for the escalation that seemed increasingly inevitable. "You're mighty quiet this morning," Tom observed, studying Jacob's face for clues to his thoughts. "Something bothering you that I should know about?" Jacob considered sharing his encounter with Aiyana, but quickly dismissed the idea as potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. Tom Bradley was a decent man and a reliable neighbor, but his attitude toward Apache peoples was shaped by fear and prejudice that made him see enemies in every shadow. News that Jacob had been talking peacefully with an Apache woman would spread throughout the settler community within days, painting him as either a fool or a collaborator. "Just thinking about what it all means for folks like us," Jacob replied carefully. "More soldiers in the territory usually means more restrictions on how we can use the land and water. Might not be as good for ranchers as people assume." Tom nodded thoughtfully, accepting Jacob's explanation without suspicion. The 2 men spent the rest of the morning repairing fence lines damaged by the previous night's storm, working in comfortable silence that allowed Jacob to process his swirling thoughts about Aiyana and the implications of their unexpected meeting. Over the following days, Jacob found himself returning repeatedly to Willow Creek despite Aiyana's warning about the dangers such visits might pose. He told himself that he needed to monitor the water situation for his cattle, but truthfully, he hoped for another glimpse of the remarkable woman who had challenged his assumptions about Apache peoples and hinted at possibilities he had never considered. The creek remained empty of human presence during his visits, though Jacob noticed signs that someone had been there recently: footprints in soft mud that matched the size and shape of Aiyana's bare feet, and small offerings of sage and wildflowers arranged on rocks in patterns that suggested ritual significance. These discoveries both thrilled and worried him, confirming that she continued to use this location while reinforcing how little he understood about Apache customs and beliefs. On the 4th night after their initial encounter, Jacob's restless sleep was interrupted by sounds that didn't belong in the usual symphony of desert night sounds. His years of frontier living had trained him to distinguish between natural wilderness noises and those that might signal human presence, whether friendly or hostile. What he heard now fell into the latter category: the careful placement of feet trying to avoid detection and the subtle whisper of clothing brushing against vegetation. Jacob slipped from his bed and retrieved his rifle, moving to a window where he could observe the area around his cabin without exposing himself to potential gunfire. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to reveal several shadowy figures positioned strategically around his property. Their movements and positions suggested Apache warriors conducting either reconnaissance or preparation for an attack. His heart hammered as he counted at least 5 distinct figures, though there might have been others concealed beyond his limited field of vision. Jacob's mind raced through possible explanations for their presence. Perhaps they sought retaliation for some perceived offense, or maybe his conversations with Aiyana had been discovered and interpreted as espionage or betrayal of Apache interests. The siege, if that's what this was, continued for nearly an hour without any overt aggressive moves from the surrounding warriors. They maintained their positions and observation, but made no attempt to approach the cabin or call for his surrender. Jacob began to wonder if their purpose might be something other than immediate violence. Then a familiar voice called softly from the darkness near his front door. "Jacob Matthews, I would speak with you without weapons between us." It was Aiyana, though her tone carried a formality that had been absent during their creekside conversation. Jacob realized that she had come with an escort of tribal warriors, suggesting that their meeting held official significance within her community's power structure. "I'm listening," Jacob called back, though he kept his rifle ready for instant use if the situation deteriorated. "Step outside where we can see you clearly," Aiyana replied. "Bring no weapons, and no harm will come to you unless you attempt treachery." Jacob found himself facing the most important decision of his adult life. He could remain barricaded in his cabin and probably survive until morning, when the Apache warriors would likely withdraw to avoid daylight exposure. But such a choice would forever close the door on whatever possibilities Aiyana had hinted at during their previous conversation. Alternatively, he could trust her word and step outside unarmed to face whatever judgment or proposal she had come to deliver. This option carried obvious risks, but it also offered the only chance to learn why she had sought him out and what role she expected him to play in the larger conflict that seemed to be intensifying throughout the territory. Jacob made his choice, setting the rifle aside and stepping out into the moonlit clearing that surrounded his modest cabin. The cool night air carried scents of sage and dust, along with something else that might have been the smoke from distant fires or the lingering presence of Apache warriors who moved through darkness like living shadows. Aiyana emerged from concealment near a cluster of prickly pear cactus, and Jacob could see that she wore full traditional dress that suggested ceremonial or diplomatic importance. Her long hair was braided with what appeared to be small silver ornaments, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone representing her people's interests in a matter of great consequence. "You show courage by coming out to meet us," she said, approaching to within conversational distance while maintaining awareness of the warriors who remained concealed around the perimeter. "This speaks well of your character and your understanding of honor." "What do you need from me?" Jacob asked directly, since the circumstances seemed to call for plain speaking rather than diplomatic niceties. Aiyana paused, studying his face in the moonlight as if searching for something that would confirm or deny her hopes about his potential reliability. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her concerns, because her posture relaxed slightly and her voice took on a more personal tone. "War is coming whether we wish it or not," she said. "The young men of my people grow tired of watching their hunting grounds become cattle pastures, while your settlers speak increasingly of clearing the territory of Apache presence entirely. Blood has already been spilled, and more will follow unless wiser voices can find another path." Jacob nodded, having reached similar conclusions based on the escalating incidents reported by neighbors and the territorial authorities. "What kind of path did you have in mind?" he asked. "One that requires men and women of good faith on both sides to take risks that others would call foolish," Aiyana replied. "You have shown that you can see Apache people as human beings rather than obstacles to be removed. This is rare among your kind, but it may be enough to serve as a beginning." The weight of her words and their implications settled over Jacob like a heavy blanket. She was asking him to serve as some kind of intermediary or advocate, a role that would put him at odds with virtually every other settler in the region while requiring him to trust Apache leaders he had never met with his life and reputation. "What would you need me to do?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change his life irrevocably. Aiyana glanced toward the concealed warriors, communicating something through subtle gestures that Jacob couldn't interpret but which seemed to receive approval from the unseen observers. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened into something approaching warmth, though her words remained carefully measured. Tomorrow night, my father will meet with war leaders from 3 bands to decide whether the Apache people should begin full resistance against white settlement or attempt one final effort at peaceful coexistence, she said. Your voice, as one who might speak for settlers who prefer peace to war, could influence that decision in ways that save many lives on both sides. Jacob felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he contemplated the enormity of what she was proposing. To attend such a meeting would mark him permanently as a collaborator in the eyes of his neighbors, while failure to persuade the Apache leaders might result in his death and the escalation of violence throughout the territory. Yet, as he looked into Aiyana's eyes, Jacob realized that his choice had been made from the moment he first saw her bathing in Willow Creek. Some encounters changed a man's destiny whether he wished it or not, and this was clearly one of those pivotal moments that would define the rest of his life. Where and when? He asked, accepting the role she had offered despite its dangers and uncertainties. 2 hours after sunset, at the old Spanish mission ruins near Eagle Rock, Aiyana replied, "Come alone and unarmed, as you have tonight. Bring only your words and your commitment to preventing unnecessary bloodshed." She turned to leave, then paused one final time. "There is something else you should understand, Jacob Matthews," she said. "My father is war chief of our band, and I am his only daughter. What passes between us has not gone unnoticed by my people, and some see it as either weakness or betrayal of Apache interests." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow, explaining both the escort of warriors and the formal nature of this midnight visit. He had unknowingly become involved with the daughter of a war chief, at the worst possible time for such complications to arise. The political implications alone could prove fatal regardless of whatever personal feelings might exist between them. "Are you saying I should stay away from the meeting?" Jacob asked, though he already knew that retreat was no longer an option for either of them. "I am saying that both our lives now depend on whether you can convince my father and the other war leaders that peace serves Apache interests better than war," Aiyana replied. "If you fail, we will both face consequences that neither of us can escape." With those ominous words, she melted back into the darkness, followed by the subtle sounds of her warrior escort withdrawing from their positions around his cabin. Jacob remained standing in his doorway until the desert fell silent once again, leaving him alone with the magnitude of the commitment he had just made. The following day passed with agonizing slowness as Jacob attempted to prepare arguments that might persuade Apache war leaders to choose negotiation over violence. He had no experience in diplomacy or tribal politics, and his knowledge of Apache customs was limited to second-hand accounts that might be unreliable or distorted by cultural bias. What he did have was genuine respect for Aiyana and her people, along with a desperate desire to prevent the escalation of conflict that would inevitably consume innocent lives on both sides. Perhaps those simple truths would carry more weight than sophisticated rhetoric in a council of warriors who valued honesty above clever words. As sunset approached, Jacob saddled his horse and began the ride toward Eagle Rock, where the ruins of an 18th-century Spanish mission provided a neutral meeting ground that belonged neither to Apache tradition nor to American settlement. The location's history of failed religious conversion attempts seemed grimly appropriate for a gathering that would determine whether two cultures could coexist or were destined for mutual destruction. The mission ruins appeared ghostly in the fading light, with crumbling adobe walls and empty window frames that seemed to watch Jacob's approach with the hollow stare of abandoned dreams. He dismounted at a respectful distance from the main structure and waited for whatever reception the Apache leaders had prepared for this unlikely diplomatic encounter. They emerged from concealment with the silent efficiency of desert predators, surrounding Jacob before he fully realized their presence. These were not the curious observers who had accompanied Aiyana to his cabin, but veteran warriors whose scarred faces and weathered hands spoke of countless battles and survival against overwhelming odds. At their center stood a man Jacob immediately recognized as Aiyana's father, despite never having seen him before. The resemblance was unmistakable, in the proud bearing and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog Jacob's every movement and expression. This was clearly a leader accustomed to making life and death decisions based on his assessment of human character and motivation. "You are the white rancher who speaks with my daughter beside running water," the war chief said in heavily accented but clear English. "I am called Cochetta by your people, though that is not the name given me at birth." Jacob inclined his head respectfully, understanding that he stood before one of the most feared and respected Apache leaders in the entire territory. Cochetta's reputation for both tactical brilliance and merciless treatment of enemies was legendary among settlers, making this encounter even more precarious than Jacob had anticipated. "I am honored to meet with you, Chief Cochetta," Jacob replied formally. "Your daughter said you wished to hear my thoughts about the situation between our peoples." Cochetta nodded slowly, studying Jacob with the intensity of a hunter evaluating potentially dangerous prey. "Aiyana believes you might speak with a voice different from other white settlers," he said. "She thinks your words could help us understand whether peace remains possible or whether war has become the only path to Apache survival." The weight of expectation in those words nearly overwhelmed Jacob, who realized that he held responsibility for potentially preventing or precipitating a conflict that could devastate the entire region. Everything he had learned about frontier diplomacy suggested that showing weakness would invite contempt, while appearing too aggressive might be interpreted as a threat requiring immediate retaliation. "Chief Cochetta, I believe both our peoples want the same basic things," Jacob began carefully. "We want our families to be safe, our children to have futures, and our ways of life to continue without constant fear of destruction. The question is whether we can find ways to achieve those goals without destroying each other." The other war leaders remained silent, but Jacob noticed subtle changes in their postures that suggested his words were being evaluated seriously rather than dismissed as naive optimism. Cochetta himself showed no expression, but his eyes remained fixed on Jacob's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through any attempt at deception or diplomatic manipulation. "You speak of families and children," Cochetta said after a long pause. "Tell me, White Rancher, what you would do if strangers came to your land and declared that your cattle must be moved to make room for their different way of using the same grass and water." The question cut to the heart of the territorial dispute with surgical precision, and Jacob realized that his answer would determine whether this meeting led to understanding or immediate violence. He could offer platitudes about sharing and compromise, but such responses would insult the intelligence of men who had been fighting for their homeland's survival for years. "I would be angry, and I would resist," Jacob admitted honestly. "But I would also try to understand whether the strangers intended to destroy everything I had built or whether they might be willing to find arrangements that allowed both ways of life to continue." Cochetta's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes suggested that Jacob's candid response had earned a measure of respect. "And if the strangers had superior numbers and weapons, and showed no interest in arrangements that honored your needs, then I would fight until I could fight no more," Jacob replied without hesitation. "But I would also hope that somewhere among the strangers might be individuals who understood that destroying everything I valued would not serve their long-term interests either." This time, Cochetta actually smiled, though the expression held more grimness than warmth. "My daughter chose well when she decided you might be worth the risk of this meeting," he said. "You understand that Apache people face exactly the situation you describe, and you do not insult our intelligence with promises that your government has already broken many times." Jacob felt a spark of hope that perhaps this encounter might actually accomplish something constructive, rather than simply serving as a prelude to intensified warfare. "What would it take to convince your people that some of us genuinely want to find peaceful solutions?" he asked. "Actions, not words," Cochetta replied immediately. "We have heard many pretty speeches from white officials who speak of friendship, while their soldiers destroy our camps and drive our people onto reservations where they sicken and die. If you truly wish peace, you must prove it by taking risks that cost you something valuable." The challenge was clear, though Jacob wasn't certain what form such proof might take or whether he possessed anything valuable enough to serve as convincing evidence of his sincerity. His modest ranch and small cattle herd hardly constituted significant sacrifices in the context of a territorial war that could consume thousands of lives. "What kind of proof would satisfy you?" Jacob asked, though he suspected the answer might require commitments he was unprepared to make. Cochetta exchanged glances with the other war leaders, communicating through subtle gestures that Jacob couldn't interpret, but which seemed to reach some form of consensus among the Apache Council. When the war chief looked back at Jacob, his expression had grown even more serious. 3 days from now, soldiers will attack our winter camp near Black Canyon, Cochetta said quietly. They believe they move in secret, but Apache scouts have watched their preparations and know their plans. We could withdraw our people to safety, but doing so would mean abandoning everything we cannot carry and allowing the soldiers to claim another victory in their war against our way of life. Jacob felt cold sweat break out across his forehead as he grasped the implications of what he was hearing. Cochetta was offering him advanced knowledge of military operations that could be used to warn the authorities or to help the Apache prepare an effective defense. Either choice would mark him as a traitor to one side or the other in this escalating conflict. Alternatively, Cochetta continued, a white rancher who happened to stumble upon information about an imminent attack on innocent Apache families might feel compelled by his conscience to warn the targeted people, despite the personal risks such action would entail. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Jacob remained silent, he would be complicit in what Cochetta clearly expected to be a massacre of noncombatants. If he provided warning to the Apache camp, he would be actively aiding the enemy and could face charges of treason if his actions were discovered. Yet as Jacob looked around the circle of weathered faces illuminated by moonlight filtering through the mission ruins, he realized that his choice had already been made. These were not faceless enemies, but human beings fighting for their survival against overwhelming odds. Whatever label his own people might attach to his actions, he could not stand by and allow innocent families to be slaughtered when he possessed the power to prevent it. How would such information reach your people if someone felt compelled to share it? Jacob asked carefully, understanding that even this question marked him as a collaborator in the eyes of territorial authorities. Cochetta's smile returned, warmer this time and touched with what might have been genuine respect. Aiyana often walks near Willow Creek in the early morning hours, he said. A rancher who happened to encounter her there might find opportunities for conversation about many subjects of mutual concern. The meeting concluded with formal courtesies that felt surreal given the magnitude of the commitments Jacob had just undertaken. As the Apache leaders melted back into the desert darkness, he found himself alone among the mission ruins with the crushing weight of decisions that could not be undone or reconsidered. The ride back to his cabin passed in a blur of conflicted thoughts and practical concerns that Jacob couldn't organize into any coherent plan of action. He had crossed a line that separated law-abiding citizens from active participants in territorial rebellion, but the alternative had been to remain silent while innocent people died in a surprise attack that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Sleep proved impossible, as Jacob wrestled with the implications of his new role as an unofficial intelligence source for Apache resistance efforts. Dawn found him exhausted and hollow-eyed, facing a day that would require him to maintain normal appearances while secretly preparing to commit what most of his neighbors would consider an act of treason. The morning routine of checking his cattle and mending fences felt like a charade performed for an audience that didn't exist. Though Jacob understood the importance of maintaining his regular patterns to avoid suspicion, any significant change in his behavior might attract attention from neighbors like Tom Bradley, who had grown increasingly paranoid about Apache sympathizers among the settler community. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Jacob saddled his horse and rode toward Willow Creek under the pretense of checking his water rights and looking for signs of predator activity among his herd. The familiar path through the canyon felt different now, charged with significance that transformed every rock and tree into a landmark in his personal journey toward an uncertain destiny. He found Aiyana waiting near the spot where their first encounter had occurred, though this time she was fully clothed and bore the serious expression of someone engaged in matters of life and death. Her greeting was formal and cautious, acknowledging their changed relationship from curious strangers to co-conspirators in a dangerous game of territorial politics. "My father said you would come," she said without preamble. "Did his words convince you that Apache people deserve the same consideration you would give to any family facing destruction?" Jacob dismounted and secured his horse before approaching the creek bank where Aiyana stood with her arms crossed and her dark eyes fixed on his face. Everything about her posture suggested that she was prepared for disappointment, as if she had learned not to expect too much from white settlers who made promises during peaceful conversations but abandoned them when real risks became apparent. "The attack will come at dawn, 3 days from now," Jacob said quietly. "Soldiers from Fort Apache, probably 2 companies plus local militia. They plan to surround the canyon and prevent anyone from escaping while they search every shelter for weapons or evidence of raiding activities." Aiyana's expression didn't change, but Jacob noticed a subtle relaxation in her shoulders that suggested relief at his willingness to share the dangerous intelligence. "How many soldiers?" she asked, immediately focusing on practical details that would determine her people's response to the threat. "At least 60, maybe more depending on how many militia volunteers join the operation," Jacob replied. "They're bringing pack horses for supplies, which suggests they plan to stay in the area for several days rather than conducting a quick strike and withdrawal." She nodded thoughtfully, already calculating the tactical implications of the information he had provided. "This intelligence will save many lives," she said. "My people will not forget that you chose to warn us despite the danger to yourself." Jacob understood that he had just burned the last bridge that might have allowed him to retreat back to his previous life as a neutral observer in the territorial conflict. Whatever happened in the coming days, he would be marked as either a hero or a traitor depending on which side ultimately prevailed in the larger struggle for control of the Southwest. "What happens now?" he asked, though he suspected that events had already been set in motion beyond anyone's ability to control or redirect. "Now we discover whether Apache courage and white conscience can together forge something stronger than the hatred that drives both our peoples toward destruction," Aiyana replied. "The next few days will test everything we believe about the possibility of peace between different worlds." She stepped closer, and for a moment her official composure gave way to something more personal and vulnerable. "There is something else you should know, Jacob Matthews," she said softly. "What grows between us cannot be separated from the larger conflict that threatens to consume everything we value. If you continue on this path, you risk not only your life but any chance of returning to the world you knew before we met." The warning was clear, but Jacob had already counted the costs and made his choice. "Some risks are worth taking," he said simply, "especially when the alternative is living with knowledge that you could have prevented innocent suffering but chose safety instead." Aiyana smiled then, the first genuine expression of warmth he had seen from her since their moonlit encounter at his cabin. "My father was right about you," she said. "You understand honor in ways that many of your people seem to have forgotten." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching through the canyon, forcing both Jacob and Aiyana to take cover behind the large boulder that had provided concealment during their first meeting. Through gaps in the rock formation, they watched a patrol of territorial militia ride past, clearly heading toward the Apache winter camp to conduct reconnaissance in preparation for the planned attack. Jacob counted 8 riders, all heavily armed and moving with the confident swagger of men who believed they held overwhelming advantages over their intended targets. Their leader was someone he recognized: Bill Hawkins, a local rancher whose hatred of Apache peoples had grown obsessive following the loss of his brother in a raid 2 years earlier. "They're scouting the approach routes," Jacob whispered to Aiyana, who had pressed close against him in the confined hiding space. "That means the attack might come sooner than 3 days if they decide the tactical situation favors immediate action." Aiyana nodded grimly, understanding the implications of this development. "I must warn my people tonight," she said. "Will you ride with me?" The question represented another escalation in Jacob's involvement with Apache resistance efforts, transforming him from an intelligence source into an active participant in their defensive preparations. Yet as he looked into Aiyana's eyes, he realized that his answer had never really been in doubt. "Yes," he said simply, "but we'll need to be careful about how we approach their camp. If sentries mistake me for an enemy scout, this could end badly for both of us." They waited until the militia patrol had disappeared around a bend in the canyon before emerging from concealment and making plans for the dangerous journey ahead. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the desert landscape, Jacob understood that he was about to cross the final threshold separating his old life from whatever destiny awaited him in the company of a Apache war chief's daughter who had somehow become the center of his world. The ride to the Apache winter camp took them through terrain that grew increasingly wild and forbidding as they moved away from settled areas into the heart of traditional tribal hunting grounds. Jacob had never ventured this deep into Apache territory, and he found himself constantly alert for signs of danger from both natural predators and human enemies who might view his presence as an unacceptable intrusion. Aiyana rode with the effortless grace of someone who had grown up in these mountains, guiding them along paths that were invisible to Jacob's inexperienced eyes, but which clearly represented generations of accumulated knowledge about safe passage through hostile terrain. Her ability to navigate by starlight and subtle landmark features left him both impressed and humbled by the depth of wisdom contained within Apache traditions. They encountered the first sentries about 2 miles from the main camp, warriors who materialized from shadows with weapons ready before recognizing Aiyana and allowing them to continue. Jacob noticed how quickly word of his presence spread ahead of their arrival, carried by signal methods he couldn't detect but which obviously functioned with remarkable efficiency across considerable distances. The winter camp itself was larger than Jacob had expected, with more than 40 lodges arranged in a pattern that suggested both defensive considerations and respect for tribal social structures. Smoke from cooking fires drifted through the evening air, carrying scents that reminded Jacob of his own childhood memories of family gatherings and community celebrations. Chief Cochetta emerged from the largest lodge as they approached, flanked by the same war leaders who had attended the meeting at the mission ruins. His expression remained neutral, but Jacob detected a subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested his presence here carried significance beyond simple intelligence sharing. The white rancher comes to stand with Apache families facing soldier guns, Cochetta observed, making the statement sound like a question that demanded clarification of Jacob's intentions. I came to provide whatever help I can, Jacob replied honestly, and to learn whether my earlier information proves accurate when tested against your scout's observations. Cochetta nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied with Jacob's straightforward response. Our young men returned an hour ago from watching the soldier camps, he said. They report that your words speak truth. Many blue coats gather for attack, and militia riders scout our trails like hunting wolves. The confirmation of the impending attack sent a ripple of activity throughout the camp as families began preparing for evacuation or defense, according to whatever plan the tribal leaders had developed. Jacob watched women gathering essential supplies while men checked weapons and discussed tactical options in rapid Apache that he couldn't understand but which clearly conveyed urgency and determination. What will you do? Jacob asked Cochetta, though he wasn't certain whether his question referred to the immediate military threat or the larger question of Apache response to escalating territorial conflicts. We will not run like rabbits from our winter homes, Cochetta replied firmly. But neither will we stand in the open and let soldier bullets cut down our children. Apache warriors know how to turn hunter advantages into hunter disadvantages. Jacob realized he was about to witness preparations for what could become one of the most significant battles in the ongoing territorial war. His role as an observer and intelligence source was evolving into something approaching active participation in Apache military planning, though he wasn't certain what contributions he might make to discussions conducted by veteran warriors with decades of combat experience. Aiyana appeared at his elbow, carrying traditional Apache weapons that Jacob had never seen up close. Can you use a bow? She asked quietly, offering him a weapon that looked both beautiful and deadly in the flickering light from nearby fires. I'm better with a rifle, Jacob admitted, though he accepted the bow and tested its weight and balance in his hands. But I'm willing to learn whatever might help protect innocent people from unnecessary violence. Good, Aiyana said with approval. Because tomorrow you will have opportunities to prove whether white conscience and Apache courage can fight together for something greater than either can achieve alone. As the night deepened around the busy camp, Jacob found himself drawn into preparations for a battle that would test everything he believed about honor, loyalty, and the possibility of finding common ground between cultures that seemed destined for mutual destruction. Whatever happened in the coming dawn, he knew that his life would never again follow the simple patterns of ranching and frontier survival that had defined his previous existence. The attack came exactly as Jacob's intelligence had predicted, with soldiers approaching the canyon at first light, while militia units moved to block escape routes through the surrounding hills. But the Apache families were gone, evacuated during the night to hidden strongholds that had sheltered their people during countless previous conflicts with various enemies over the centuries. What the soldiers found instead was a carefully prepared defensive position manned by Apache warriors who had chosen to make a stand rather than allow their winter camp to be destroyed without consequence. The battle that followed would be remembered in both Apache oral tradition and territorial military records as a turning point that demonstrated the possibility of honorable warfare between peoples who respected each other's courage, even while fighting for incompatible goals. Jacob fought alongside Apache warriors that day, his rifle proving more effective than the borrowed bow in the long-range exchanges that characterized most of the engagement. But what he remembered most clearly was not the violence itself, but the moments of mutual respect that occurred between opposing forces who recognized shared qualities of determination and sacrifice in their enemies. When the fighting ended with both sides withdrawing to assess their losses and plan their next moves, Jacob found himself irrevocably changed by the experience of standing with people who had accepted him as a comrade despite the cultural gulf that separated their worlds. He had discovered something about himself and about the possibility of building bridges between different ways of understanding honor, loyalty, and the responsibilities that came with the courage to take meaningful risks. The weeks that followed the battle at Black Canyon saw Jacob emerge as an unofficial mediator between Apache leaders and those settlers who were willing to consider alternatives to the cycle of escalating violence that threatened to consume the entire territory. His unique position as someone trusted by both sides, despite the suspicions of extremists in each camp, allowed him to facilitate conversations that might otherwise have been impossible. The work was dangerous and often frustrating, requiring Jacob to navigate between competing demands and expectations while maintaining the trust of people who had every reason to doubt his motives and capabilities. But gradually, through patient effort and countless small gestures of good faith, progress began to emerge from the seemingly intractable conflicts that had defined the region's recent history. Aiyana became his partner in these diplomatic efforts. Her knowledge of Apache customs and her ability to communicate in both languages, proving invaluable in bridging the cultural misunderstandings that often derailed attempts at negotiation. Their relationship deepened beyond the attraction that had first drawn them together, evolving into a partnership based on shared commitment to finding peaceful solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The territorial authorities were slow to accept the legitimacy of these grassroots peace initiatives, preferring the clarity of military solutions to the complexity of cultural accommodation. But as word spread of successful local agreements between Apache bands and settler communities, pressure began building for official recognition of what had been accomplished through private courage and determination. Jacob's reputation as a man who could work with Apache peoples while maintaining the respect of his settler neighbors gradually spread throughout the territory, bringing him opportunities to mediate disputes and prevent conflicts that might otherwise have erupted into violence. The work was never easy, and there were failures that cost lives on both sides, but the overall trajectory moved toward hope rather than despair. Months after their first encounter beside Willow Creek, Jacob and Aiyana returned to that sacred spot where their unlikely partnership had begun. The creek ran clear and strong, reflecting the desert sky and cottonwood leaves that rustled in the evening breeze like whispered promises of peace and renewal. They stood together on the bank where everything had started, watching the water flow toward distant valleys where Apache children played and settler families built their futures with less fear than had seemed possible during those dark days of escalating warfare. The work of building lasting peace between their peoples was far from finished, but foundations had been laid that might support something lasting and beautiful if tended with care and courage. "Do you ever regret the path that brought us here?" Aiyana asked, her hand finding Jacob's as they watched the sun set over the land they both loved and had fought to protect. Jacob considered the question seriously, thinking of all the comfortable certainties he had abandoned and the dangers he had accepted in choosing to stand with her people against the forces that sought their destruction. His old life as a simple rancher seemed impossibly distant now, like memories from someone else's existence. "No," he said finally, understanding that his answer carried the weight of all the choices that had led them to this moment of quiet hope beside the flowing water. "Some things are worth every risk, and some discoveries change everything in ways that make the old world seem too small to hold what you've become." The creek murmured its ancient song of persistence and renewal, carrying their shared hopes toward a future that remained uncertain but no longer seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities to prove whether love could indeed triumph over hatred, whether courage could overcome fear, and whether two people from different worlds could build something lasting together in the spaces between their separate destinies. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jacob and Aiyana made their way back toward the communities that had learned to trust their judgment and rely on their commitment to finding peaceful solutions to the conflicts that had once seemed destined to destroy everything they bay. Valued. The work was far from finished, but it had begun, and that beginning carried within it the seeds of transformation that might one day bloom into the kind of peace that honored both Apache traditions and settler dreams without requiring either to be abandoned or destroyed. The river flowed on through the desert night, carrying their story toward whatever endings time and circumstance would write in the years to come.